In the early 80s, Cannon Films, specifically the producer duo of Golan Globus, was churning out dozens of low-budget action and exploitation films. They were an independent studio looking to move into blockbuster territory, so they took a huge gamble by investing $23 million into the adaptation of the novel Space Vampires. If you're laughing over the title, just remember that one of the most important science fiction movies of all time, Blade Runner, is based off a short story called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Tobe Hooper, the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, had just finished doing the massive hit Poltergeist in 1982. He was friends with producer Boaz Davidson, who recommended him to Menachem Golan as the person to helm Space Vampires. Hooper had a meeting with Golan, who gave him a copy of the book and said, "You do this movie." Hooper read it and thought it was fantastic. He had been doing nothing but horror up to this point, and was overjoyed at the prospect of directing a sci-fi movie. Seeing the potential of working with Hooper, Cannon signed him to a 3-picture deal. Hooper worked briefly with writer Dan O'Bannon on Return of the Living Dead, but left the film, and O'Bannon took over as director. Considering O'Bannon wrote the screenplay for Alien, Hooper knew he'd be perfect to write Space Vampires. He wanted the movie to be a sci-fi version of an ancient siren tale, and a metaphor for the saying, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." While Marilyn Burns was working on Helter Skelter, Hooper stopped by the set often to visit. She introduced him to her co-star, Stephen Railsback. Railsback did an amazing job as Charles Manson, and Hooper always wanted to work with him. After seeing him in The Stuntman, he offered him the lead in Space Vampires. Railsback accepted, excited because he never did a sci-fi movie before. The biggest problem they had was finding an actress for the lead vampire, simply known as Space Girl. Producer Menachem Golan was pretty hands-off with the production, with one exception. He insisted the Space Girl be nude the entire film. This posed a major problem because none of the actresses they interviewed were comfortable in doing so. Finally, after seeing hundreds of actresses, they met 19-year-old French actress Mathilde May. May was an ex-ballerina who had only recently gotten into acting. She was nervous about the nudity, but her agent convinced her to do the role because it would be huge for her career. She accepted, but there was another problem. She didn't speak English. Since it was a while before filming began, she was able to learn her lines phonetically. The second vampire was Christopher Jagger, the brother of Mick Jagger. Hooper directed Billy Idol's music video, Dancing With Myself, and wanted him to play the third vampire. Unfortunately, he was too busy touring, and his schedule wouldn't allow it. Wanting to make this more than just another sci-fi film, they began to hire some major talent within the industry. They hired special effects wizard John Dykstra, a 2-time Oscar winner, one for Star Wars, and the other for developing the Dykstra Flex camera. They hired most of the crew from 2001: A Space Odyssey, including Oscar-nominated production designer John Graysmark. Nick Maley was the makeup effects supervisor on the film. He said that while he's most proud and well known for his work on Yoda in Star Wars, Lifeforce was his best work. Finally, they brought in Alan Hume. He was the DOP on numerous Bond films, as well as Return of the Jedi. With this amazing group of talented people and the largest budget Cannon ever had, they set off to make Space Vampires. Only Hooper had hated the title. They had a B-list title for an A-list project. It sounded too much like what people would expect from a Cannon film. Wanting to sound more grandiose, they changed it to Lifeforce, which admittedly sounds much better for this type of film. The movie was about a group of astronauts that unknowingly unleash a trio of space vampires on Earth. The leader, known only as Space Girl, is unstoppable. She drains the life of any man or woman she encounters, which starts a chain reaction that'll destroy all humanity on Earth. In the book, the alien ship was found in the asteroid belt. Hooper had the idea of having the ship hidden within Halley's Comet, since the comet would be passing Earth shortly after the film was to be released. Also, because in ancient times, Halley's Comet was seen as a harbinger of doom. The shoot was going to be long, 120 days, 6 months of filming. They needed that much time because some of the scenes, like the astronauts flying into and around the spaceship, took days just to get a few seconds. This was back in the day when there was no such thing as wire removal, so they had to be creative with their camera angles to conceal them. The rig they used was the same one from the film Superman, that suspended them 40 feet in the air. The problem was, if one of the actors moved the wrong way, it would start a pendulum effect that would only get worse. On numerous occasions, they had to stop filming because one or more of the actors threw up in their suit. They took over 2 of the largest sound stages in London, one where they filmed Star Wars, and the other known as the 007 stage. The sets they built were enormous. While there was some green screen compositing work with the astronauts flying into the spaceship, the interiors were all real. Dykstra modeled the alien ship after, of all things, an artichoke. They wanted the alien ship to appear to be alive, so they had the astronauts flying in through giant veins. Since Hooper had a love for horror, he incorporated elements of that into the movie. Being that at its core it was a vampire film, he made a sort of Hammer sci-fi film by adding things of a gothic nature, such as the leaded iron sword and possession. Patrick Stewart had a small part as Dr. Armstrong. Along with Excalibur and Dune, this was one of the largest productions he had been involved with at that point. Years later, he was on The Tonight Show and was asked who his first on-screen kiss was. He laughed and said it was Stephen Railsback. Stewart had said of all the people over the years, Hooper was his favorite director to work with. The 3 vampires in the clear coffins were actually full body cast mannequins for the wide shots. This was so they didn't have to worry about having the actors standing inside for hours. The streets of London were all sets, and some of the destruction was done with miniatures composited in via green screen. The theme park, Tuctonia, had a scale replica of London. They were allowed to film there as long as they didn't damage any of the city, so all the buildings that blew up were ones that they brought in. The crew called the dehydrated victims of the space vampires the Walking Shriveled. The man and the woman in the base were both animatronic and took 23 puppeteers to control. All the cables ran up from underneath the table into the puppet, and they watched the movements from a monitor out of frame. It took days to animate each one. May was nude for the 100 of the 120-day shoot, even though her on-screen time only counts for about 7 minutes of film. Initially, she was nervous and embarrassed about being nude, but quickly got over it. The only time when it was difficult was the outdoor scene, since they were filming in winter, and it was well below zero. In the scene where she escapes the installation, there was a crew member behind this tree waiting for her with a blanket. With May's background in ballet, it made her movements eerily perfect and added to her performance. She was stunning, but her poise and stoic expression let you know that something was amiss. Well, that and that she was a completely nude woman wandering around a military base. For the helicopter scene, they had to cover May in a latex suit and encase her in plastic veins and a syrup like blood. The process of getting her into the suit took 8 hours. When the guard dies the second time, they had a life-size dummy with hoses that sucked all the air out, which made him appear to deflate in front of them. When Hooper was younger, he got in an accident on an ATV, where his hand was caught between the handlebar and a cinder block wall. When he took his hand out, it tore the skin off, which inspired him to do this scene. The light flying around London was a 10K light bulb suspended by a wire that Dykstra concealed with optical effects. There were hundreds of the Walking Shriveled all around the streets at the end. The production was huge. Golan was sure this was going to be the film of the year. It clearly was another level of filmmaking, and every bit as epic as Hooper wanted it to be. After a grueling 6-month shoot, the film wrapped. Hooper assembled his director's cut, which was almost 2 hours long. Golan said it was fine for the release in the UK, but it wouldn't go over well in the US unless it was shorter. Hooper supervised the edit, and the US theatrical cut was trimmed of about 20 minutes. When the film was released in the US, it flopped. While it did open in 4th place, it was going up against The Goonies, Rambo, and Cocoon, all 3 of which were in the top 10 highest-grossing films of the year. So it did have the deck stacked against it. Meanwhile, the full uncut version was released in England, where it was much more successful. The US cut removed the amazing opening score by Henry Mancini, which perfectly set the tone of the film. Listen to this. Versus this. Kind of underwhelming compared to the original, don't you think? Then it severely truncated the opening, reducing the introduction of the crew of the shuttle Churchill and their mission down to a text crawl. The whole beginning feels like it's in way too much of a hurry to get to the aliens. They also drastically reduced the violence and nudity. After the movie, Hooper made his 2 other canon films, the remake of Invaders from Mars, and the completely off-the-wall Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Hooper enjoyed his time working with Cannon, and would most likely be still making films for them, had they not gone out of business. Lifeforce is exactly what director Tobe Hooper set out to make, an epic sci-fi film. Cannon took a huge risk in making such an expensive picture, and while it failed on a box office level, it succeeded in being one of the most unique sci-fi films of all time. After almost 30 years, the film has been restored to its full glory for its Blu-ray release. People in the US can finally see Hooper's complete vision as it was intended. The amazing visuals, the outstanding practical effects, the unique story, and the incredible explosive finale were, and still are, monumental. This is a landmark film in Cannon's catalog, and I feel if they had released the director's cut in the US, it would have greatly helped to cement them as more than just a schlock factory. Also, how awesome is this poster? The director's cut returns the film to its massive scale. It feels like the apocalyptic tale that it always was, instead of the confused sprint to the finish line of the US theatrical cut. This is an incredible sci-fi film that deserves way more credit than it gets. Not to mention Matilda May's performance. Some see her role simply as naked chick who walks around, but she owned the role. She exuded confidence, and you had no problem believing she'd be able to conquer the mind of any man. Well, maybe not the guy who tries to lure her in with a cookie.
No, that's why we noticed it. She was with a dark-haired girl. A real good-looking bird and all. Didn't have a lot of clothes on either. We thought they might be, well, you know.
Yes.